Okay. Okay, we are now recording. So we can't do Chatham House rules, right? If we're recording. Anyway, this I should put a
Who are you
here.
recording this for?
Oh, for the archives, basically. The course that we give, and we can talk about how it's used. It's basically people taking the course who missed a session and who want to get a chance to see it. It doesn't go farther than that.
I'll tell you one story about Chatham House rules. So about 10 years ago, I gave a talk at Chatham House in London, and someone from the Russian embassy was there taking notes. So when the Chatham House people said, Chatham House rules, I said, what do you mean Chatham House rules? It's going to go straight back to whoever in Moscow. But
that's funny. And by the way, this is a pedagogic exercise. So people not familiar, Chatham House. I was at Chatham House last month and met our friend there who does Russia, and I hate the word Eurasia, but does Eurasia. And
James Nixie?
James Nixie, yes. What a wonderful, hospitable gentleman he is. And he has spoken on this series. For those not familiar, Chatham House, a very important think tank in London. The Chatham House rules, you've always heard of them. You may not know exactly what they mean. It means you may quote an idea, but you may not attribute that idea to any person or to any venue. That's kind of esoteric, isn't it, Professor Stent? But people on this call who are in a learning mode, it's good for them to know. Listen, everybody, just a brief note at the top. I see 2 or 3 on the call who have offered to be mentors in the fall. If you would like to stay on this call after we've finished recording, we can talk a bit about that. And because I'll soon be putting out an announcement for the fall contingent. Professor Angela Stent, wow. What august and elite group have you not been part of in your field? I'm just looking at your bio here. Intelligence officer, National Intelligence Council. Again, to put this in context, we call it the NIC, the NIC. The National Intelligence, you've heard about the 13 or 15 intelligence bureaus and agencies in the US government. The very top of the pyramid is this very, very select group, the National Intelligence Council, which includes civilians and foreign service. And these are the people who think ahead. And I just looked it up, that you really should check out something called Global Trends 2040. The NIC puts out, is it every 5 years, Professor?
It's every 4 years.
Every 4 years.
This is for new administrations, basically.
Okay, well, this is a major planning document built up by the most knowledgeable people in their fields. So Professor Stent was a member of that. She worked at NATO with the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, James Stavridis. What an interesting individual, James Stavridis. Would love, and Philip Breedlove. Stavridis, I know a little bit. Maybe you can tell us. He's amazing, this man, his intellect. She has also been the director of the Eurasia, the Russian and Eurasia branch of the Foreign Service School, the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, probably the most prestigious department in Washington. And in addition, was in the Office of Policy Planning in both the Clinton and Bush administrations. Now, we've talked about this office when we talked about George F. Kennan. So with that said, does everybody understand the magnitude of this meeting? I hope you do. Angela Stent, please, any topic is open to you. We'd love to know about those institutions. You're now with Brookings, Georgetown, Office of Policy and Planning, Supreme Command. What did I leave out? And the NIC. This is the embodiment, everybody, of the most prestigious organizations we have in policy and planning for this troubled region that we're now dealing with. Angela Stent, over to you.
Well, let me say there's one other institution that I was affiliated with. I was a senior advisor for the last 2 years, and that was the United States Institute of Peace, which was a congressionally mandated, bipartisan, half the board was Democrat, half Republican, which was dedicated to promoting conflict resolution and peace. And they had a center on Russia and Europe, which I was part of, and we were working kind of on Ukrainian, Russian issues and everything. And the new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE,
Yes.
led by Elon Musk, closed it down 2 weeks ago,
I know.
which is very sad.
It's
Because it was doing important work, also field work in Africa, in the Middle East, and other parts of the world. Anyway, just
well,
to say
and
that.
let us imagine George Moose standing there in the
Yeah.
door. I don't know if you were there that day. The
I was
courageous-
not. I just received an email at midnight on a Friday firing me. And for me, you know, I was just one day a week. It wasn't that disastrous, but for my colleagues who were there full time and lost their salary and benefits, anyway,
Yeah.
it's too bad. There are lawsuits going on. I don't know how successful they will be.
Yeah. I was released also from a less important post. So it happens to the best people.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me go back. If you want me to talk about the institutions first, I will. So the Office of Policy Planning in the State Department, you've obviously discussed with your students here, founded, as you said, by George Kennan. And it is the part of the State Department where someone like me, who's an academic, you know, in the US, we have a system where academics or people in think tanks can go and work in the government in these roles for a limited amount of time. And so that Office of Policy Planning is where we think kind of further ahead to you know, how can we conceive of things changing, how can we deal with certain problems coming up. So that's as I say, that was a forward-looking thing, and I did that for 2 years. I've never been a political appointee. We have two kinds of appointees in the US, political and then experts, and so I was hired as an expert, and that's how I was able to be there for the last 18 months of the Clinton administration, the first 6 months of the Bush administration, when the US government was somewhat more optimistic about the potential of relations with Russia. This, of course, was when Putin had just come into power. Now, the National Intelligence Council, as you said, is an agency which is supposed to coordinate the views of all of the different intelligence agencies in the United States, of which there are 15 or maybe 16, but maybe you're right, it's 15. And when I started in this position, again, hired as an expert, and this is not a policy-oriented institution, it's really, again, analytical. When I started, the National Intelligence Council was under the direction of the director of the CIA. This was in 2004, and so we reported to him. And then in 2005, everything changed. Because of what happened on 9/11 with the terrorist attacks, there was an introspection and looking into what the intelligence community had missed. And so they established a new agency for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which now was supposed to, again, coordinate everything. And the first one with whom I did work in my second year at the NIC was Ambassador John Negroponte. So, but what we did was to coordinate people's views, and the most, I guess, the best known product of this NIC, well, one of them is the Global Trends, which was just mentioned, which is unclassified. You can read that on the website. And the other thing is called, the other product is called a National Intelligence Estimate. And that is not available to the public, although parts of it, depending on how old it is, can be declassified. And it's an interesting process because, you know, for instance, if you're writing about what you think is going to happen in Russia, you know, you get different experts around and you sort of thrash out what you do or don't agree on. I was there during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and that was another interesting exercise because we then had to say afterwards, why didn't we really see this coming? And I will say that one thing that was true in 2004, and I would say even to some extent in 2022, just before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is the underestimation of the Ukrainian people's will to fight back, to not have corrupt governments, as they believed they had, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these were the products we did. There was also turmoil when I was there in Georgia. There was turmoil in Uzbekistan. So I covered the whole of the Eurasian region when I was there, and the National Intelligence Council, still exists. And of course has a new director under President Trump. Now, with NATO, I was just on an advisory board. I wasn't in Brussels or Mons or anywhere else, but Admiral Stavridis, when he was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, we call them SACEUR, he had a group of people who were senior advisors, and he's quite a remarkable man. He's often on CNN, if anyone watches it, but a man very steeped, actually, in history, including in the history of this region. And then his successor, General Philip Breedlove, who's also quite prominent in the media too. And that was a time when Russia annexed Crimea and when the war in the Donbass began. Some people talk about this as a war between separatists. I think most of us who've looked at this carefully realize that most of these so-called separatists were Russian proxies who were egging on people in the Donbass region to fight. And so that was something with General Breedlove that we were obviously all very much caught up in during the Obama administration. So those were the different government positions I have held. I was a professor at Georgetown University for many years. I ran the Russia-Eurasian Studies Center, and before the collapse of the Soviet Union, it had a different name, and it was called the Russian Area Studies Program. And then we all had to readjust, obviously, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and reorient what we were teaching. And many of our students did a master's degree for 2 years. They have to have very good language proficiency, be it Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Croatian. We had international students, and many of the American students then went on to work in the US government, as did many of our foreign students. One of our Czech students became the Czech foreign minister, and then their representative to the United Nations. And that center still exists today. And there are more and more students actually who are interested in the whole region, I suppose partly because of the war that's going on. So I think that's a very good sign. And then the Brookings Institution is a think tank. Think tanks exist to do analysis, to write reports, and hopefully also to advise the government, both the government that's in power and then before presidential elections, to think about what you might advise the next government on. And most of these think tanks are privately funded. So the Brookings Institution is privately funded, and it raises funds from foreign governments, from philanthropists, and from other people who want to support the foreign policy program. But it also has a domestic program. It has very good economists. It looks at domestic politics in the United States. So it really covers the whole branch. And with them, I write papers. We have meetings, conferences. So I think that's probably a summary shortly of what I've done and of the different institutions.
That's the best summary I've ever heard of the most influential analytical groups in Washington. Let me see if I can provoke you. We have a pathology in our foreign policy, which is the everlasting optimism. You mentioned optimism in previous administrations. It seems like we're suckered every single time a Democratic or Republican administration sees an opening in Russia. It turns out they were wrong. Is this a pathology?
I don't know if it's a pathology. It might be human nature. So, yeah, I wrote a book which first came out in 2014, and then I updated after the annexation of Crimea, called The Limits of Partnership, US-Russian Relations in the 21st Century. And yes, I mean, even if we take the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, every administration, Democratic or Republican, has believed that it could find the key to having a better relationship with Russia. And sometimes people ask me, what is this fascination with Russia, as opposed to, it's not as if every government comes into power and thinks it can improve relations with China. I mean, it doesn't appear to have the same optimism. And I think there's just appears to be a fascination with Russia, not so much, and also with the Soviet Union beforehand, but a belief that it must be possible to have better relations with Russia. And people look back to the times when the US and, say, the Soviet Union cooperated, obviously, during World War II. That was a marriage of convenience because we had a common enemy, Nazi Germany. And when that was defeated, then relations became much more difficult. A more recent example is and coming back to the early George W. Bush administration, the cooperation between the US and Russia after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Remember, George Bush had met Vladimir Putin a few months beforehand in Slovenia, and he had come away believing that President Putin was a patriot, that he got a sense of his soul. And of course, Putin had warned him about terrorism. I mean, I remember very vividly in the fall of 2001, at the height of US cooperation, again, the common enemy was Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism. Putin came to the United States. He gave a speech at the Russian embassy that I attended, and everything was forward-looking and cooperative. And he visited President Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas. And I think the Russians were surprised about how relatively modest it was compared to what they would have thought that a US president, his home would have been one of his homes. But again, you had this era of cooperation and a belief that things could get better. But what you had after that, and I think that's a problem with US-Russian relations in general, was it was clear that the US and the Russian side had very different expectations of what this collaboration and what this new relationship would be. And for the Bush administration, they believed they helped Russia, clean up a terrorist threat in its backyard. Thus, the Soviet Union had been involved in its own Afghan war for a long time and hadn't succeeded there, had to withdraw. And then the US administration at that time, and this is similar to what President Trump's people are doing now, believed that what the US could offer Russia was a much enhanced economic relationship. And so they had a special commissions, particularly one on energy, where they were trying to get to help Russia develop its own energy sector, and US companies would get involved. Now, what was Putin's expectation? He believed that in return for supporting the US in the initial phase of the war in Afghanistan, the US would understand that Russia was a great power. Yes, it had suffered a temporary setback with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but like every great power, it had a right to a sphere of influence. And so what Putin expected was that the US would kind of turn a blind eye in terms of what Russia then shortly did in Ukraine, Georgia, other parts of the what for a better word was called the former Soviet Union. So these are very different expectations. And so that's why you then get a deterioration in relations when Putin looks at, first of all, the US involvement in the Iraq War. And then, in 2004, of course, you get a major second phase of the enlargement of the NATO alliance, which at the time Putin really didn't object to, but in retrospect says that Russia did object to. And so, everything goes downhill from then. And in 2008, in the infamous NATO summit in Bucharest, which Putin attended the only time he's ever attended a NATO summit, it was then that he told President Bush that Ukraine wasn't a country, that half of it used to be in the Russian Empire and the other half was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And and that, you know, no one should expect. I mean, this is when NATO, after a very difficult discussion, put out a compromise statement saying that one day Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO, but with absolutely no timetable, and nothing was done about it. But that obviously irked Putin. So that kind of ended that phase. So then, of course, Barack Obama is elected. He comes in, and his then Vice President Joe Biden makes a speech saying, you know, we're going to have a reset. It's time to reset relations with Russia. You have Secretary of State Hillary Clinton meeting with, of course, Foreign Minister Lavrov, a very seasoned Russian diplomat, presenting him a button with what she thought said reset on it. But the Russian word was perigruska, which actually means overload.
Right.
The real word should have been perizagruska, which would
Yeah.
have been a reset. Anyway, but for a short time, that reset appeared to be working, right? Because Dmitry Medvedev was then president. He was put in the president's office so that Putin could claim that constitutionally he wasn't doing anything wrong otherwise he would have served a third term. And Medvedev and Obama, of course, at least in the beginning, enjoyed what appeared to be a good relationship. President Medvedev visited Washington. He had hamburgers with President Obama. He opened a Twitter account, et cetera, et cetera. But then, of course, you had the annexation of Crimea, and the war in the Donbass began. And by the end of the Obama administration in 2016, of course, you had the Russian interference in the US election. And someone who worked in the Obama administration said at the end of it, President Obama kind of wished he didn't have to deal with Russia, that it would go away, but it doesn't go away. And I think that's a sentiment at the end of many of these US administrations that most presidents had, that it was just too difficult to deal with Russia, particularly after Putin came back to the Kremlin. I mean, he never really left, but at least formally in 2012. And I will just say, you know, about the first Trump administration, I think there were definitely high hopes in Russia, and I guess also in the United States. But they really didn't come to fruition because of all of the sanctions that were imposed on Russia, partly because of the election interference, partly because of the poisoning of the former GRU double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter in England. And of course, we know that Trump and Putin met a couple of times, and then COVID hit. And so Trump, I think, would have planned a trip to visit Russia. He had invited Putin to visit the United States, but all of that was no longer possible. So Biden comes in, and the Biden administration says, we're not looking for a reset, but, you know, we want stable and predictable relations. And they wanted to sort of, quote unquote, park Russia so that Russia wouldn't be a problem anymore, and they could deal with China, which was described as the main pacing threat. So we know what happened with that. You had the summit between Presidents Biden and President Putin, which went okay, if you like, but then shortly thereafter, the troop buildup occurred on Ukraine's border. And then, of course, after the full-scale invasion, the relationship was essentially cut off. And so now you do have President Trump back in office. He still believes that it's possible to have a better relationship with Russia. And at the moment, that's what Putin is focused on, is the restoration of this US-Russian relationship. He's met with Steve Witkoff, who's the main envoy at the moment, talking to Russia. You know, and and the other aspect of those talks, which maybe we'll get into, the ending the ceasefire and the attempt to find a solution to the Russia-Ukraine war isn't really going anywhere.
Yeah. Again, that's an amazing synthesis. That's the best summary I've ever heard of this relationship in the last couple of decades. Just dwelling just for a moment longer on this optimism. You've probably met Vladimir Kara-Murza since his release, and he's constantly saying, to this day, he's saying he's absolutely certain that Russia can become a democracy. He says that this would happen in a period of 72 hours, and that we must get ready, because if we don't seize the opportunity, it will pass by. This seems naive to me. What is your reading of that?
So I interviewed Vladimir Kara-Murza a couple of weeks ago at a conference. I have great respect for him. He, was jailed and poisoned for his beliefs. I think that if you are a member of the Russian opposition, you are abroad. I think you have to believe that this is possible, because otherwise, you're saying that Russia is doomed forever to be an authoritarian, repressive state. So, of course, we can look at history and we can see that, for hundreds of years, Russia has been a repressive authoritarian state, which wages war in a particularly brutal way. But there have been periods when there have been uprisings, when things have changed. And we did have the Gorbachev era and, most of the Yeltsin era where things were different. So I think that the opposition leaders like this have to believe it. And they do have supporters in Russia, although those supporters now have to be very quiet, because obviously if you express opposition to the Putin regime publicly in any way, you can be arrested and jailed. But of course, many of the Russian opposition figures are no longer in Russia. They're in Germany, they're in Britain, France, they are in the United States. So they have to believe this. Otherwise, I think it would be very difficult for them to continue fighting for this.
Yeah, it may be semantics. Kara-Murza strenuously objects to the word opposition. He says there is no such thing. I'm a dissident. This may be semantics. I don't know. When you mentioned the brief period of possible potential cooperation, JCPOA comes to mind. That agreement done by John Kerry, basically for President Biden, really appeared to be a successful possibility of having some kind of relationship with Iran. And the Russian Federation was actively supportive of that, I think.
Yeah.
Now, and now we're hearing rumors that there may be back channel communications between the current White House and the Iranian regime. Have you heard anything other than rumors about that?
Well, I mean, and you are right to point out to the JCPOA. I should have mentioned that. That was an area where there was cooperation between Russia and the United States working this out. So President Trump asked President Putin if he could intervene and help to broker some kind of an agreement with Iran whereby it would it would say that it wouldn't develop a nuclear weapons capability because it's not very far away from developing it. We know that Foreign Minister Lavrov went to Tehran after that and discussed, a variety of things with the Iranians. So we have already had Mr. Witkoff, who is also a negotiator for the Middle East, go to Oman a few days ago and have indirect negotiations with the Iranians. That is, the Iranian foreign minister was there, but it was brokered by the Omanis, I think, leaders, and they were passing notes and things. And at the very end, the Iranian foreign minister and Mr. Witkoff met. I don't think we know very much about the content of all of these talks, but certainly these contacts are going on, and I think the Trump administration really does want to persuade Iran that it should not continue enriching uranium to the extent that it is.
Steve Witkoff has said some delightful blue sky kind of unicorn sorts of statements about Russia. Is he just saying this for public consumption, or do you think he really believes that progress in the near future really is possible between the US and Russia?
Well, I think all of the Trump administration officials are reiterating that progress is possible. And even, yesterday you had this horrific Russian attack in Sumy in Ukraine, where worshippers going for Palm Sunday were killed, a significant number of people killed and many more wounded. And they're still saying, well, this war has to end. And President Trump himself says that the US is making progress. I think that the reason why President Putin has been meeting with Mr. Witkoff is he realizes that even though Witkoff has no formal government position, he's never been a diplomat, he's a successful real estate businessman, Putin understands that he's close to President Trump. And that's why you talk to this man and not to the people who are the diplomats. I, of course, was quite surprised when I heard some of the things that Witkoff said coming out of the meeting with President Putin, and also when he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. It's quite possible that he does believe these things. It's just quite notable that no one in the Trump administration has really said anything negative about the fact that they've been trying. I mean, Ukraine has agreed to a ceasefire, a temporary, 30-day ceasefire. President Zelensky agreed to that some weeks ago. Russia has not agreed to that, or it keeps reiterating that we have to get to the root causes of the conflict. But the root causes of the conflict really comes back to what I was talking about before, that the United States should recognize that Russia is a great power and that it has a right to a sphere of influence, that Ukraine belongs in that. And that's what, Putin is trying to get at.
Yeah. If we had George Kennan still with us, he was very much opposed to NATO expansion. It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to see what he thinks. One more question for me, then we go to Naomi Korn's very interesting chat. You talked about the United States seeing economic expansion or better functioning economy in Russia as a basis for the relation. Then came Jeffrey Sachs with shock therapy. And many have said that this overnight privatization that he advocated did tremendous harm to the economy. What is your feeling about that?
Well, of course, it's interesting that Jeffrey Sachs has completely changed his views now, and he blames the US for everything that's happening in the war.
Yes, that's what he says, but what he did when he
Right.
went.
So what he did, I think that I think in retrospect, it would have been better to have a more gradual transition away from, this, we can call it the communist centrally planned system. But at the time, the people who were in power at the time, at the beginning of the Yeltsin administration, Yegor Gaidar, who was the prime minister or the acting prime minister, Anatoly Chubais, the people around them, they believed that it was impossible to do gradual transition and that you had to do the shock therapy. I mean, I think certainly what went wrong with the economy in the 1990s was that the voucher privatization system, where they said, all right, we have all these big enterprises and we're going to give all the workers who live there vouchers and they're going to be able to buy things or buy into things. That really did go wrong because a lot of people didn't quite know how to do it. And then you get the rise of the oligarchs, many of whom then took the vouchers and kind of enriched themselves. And then also the loans for shares, which was prior to Yeltsin's re-election in 1996, it looked as if the communists might win. And so the Kremlin, the Yeltsin administration, enabled people like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, of course, who became briefly the richest man in Russia with his oil companies and other oligarchs at sort of very cheap prices to get their hands on different assets. And then after that, you had, of course, in 1998, because of an Asian financial crisis, you crash in Russia, a devaluation of the ruble, and the impoverishment of many Russians. So I think it's not just shock therapy, it's everything else that followed it that for many Russians gives them a very jaundiced remembrance and view of what happened in the 1990s.
I think the voucher system, if it even was intended to work, it certainly didn't. And one wonders if they even meant for it to work. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, well, that's another topic. You and I met him.
Right. Lots to talk about.
Yeah, and of course we were all intrigued. I was intrigued. Who is this guy who invited me to contact him, but then never returned? Now, Naomi Korn, in the context of Obama's reluctance to still deal with Russia in 2016, how fateful do you believe was his 2014 comment on Russia as a, quote, regional power in galvanizing Putin and the Russian elites?
So, I mean, I think it was unfortunate that he described Russia as a regional power. He also said that Putin reminded him of a bored schoolboy slouching at the back of the classroom. This is, again, after the annexation of Crimea. I mean, obviously, what Putin and other Russian leaders have sought, but particularly Putin, is kind of respect and fear. They want the United States to treat them, as an equal. One of my Russian colleagues way back when Putin came in and the sort of entente with George W. Bush began to weaken, said that what Putin wanted was an equal alliance of unequals. He wanted the US to treat Russia as if it was still a superpower, which of course it was in terms of nuclear weapons, but not in terms of its economy. And that clearly very much irritated him. But I think even before Obama, you certainly had Dick Cheney, the vice president under George W. Bush, increasingly criticizing Russia for its domestic repression. And then on one trip, he criticized Russia, I believe it was from Lithuania, and then he went to Kazakhstan and he praised President Nazarbayev, who was then the president. And if you're talking about, repression and things like that, that was also, I think, something that really annoyed President Putin. So I think what President Obama said was certainly unfortunate, but he wasn't the first US leader under Putin to criticize Russia for what it was doing.
Mhm. I encourage everybody to come in with to unmic. Maybe Jack has some input or to have questions. I have many more. One of mine is this word Eurasia. I spoke once with Ambassador Makarova, and she said she's very offended by this term because it implies Russia as the driving force of a total region. Is there any other word that occurs to you that would be less offensive to Ambassador Makarova?
Well, let me say,
Yeah.
other Ukrainians have said to me, we're European, we're not Eurasian. So that's another reason why they
Yeah.
get offended. The problem is, we did get into the habit after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, officially, you may remember in the State Department, you call them the newly independent states, the
Yeah,
NIS.
the NIS, yeah, right.
Right, but the problem is it's 5 years since that
Yeah,
happened, and to call them newly independent. So post-Soviet is also not desirable because it implies that everything that defines Ukraine, Moldova, whatever, is the Soviet Union. But you're right that Eurasia, I mean, I see Eurasia as a somewhat more neutral term, as a kind of a geographic area, but obviously Putin also talks about, Eurasia and Russia's role in it. So I don't think anyone's come up with a better term.
yeah,
Uh, Maybe you just have to call the countries by their, name, or
yeah,
to say it, but it would be more cumbersome. These were countries that were once part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union.
yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
I asked this question once of the director of the little think tank in George Washington University, the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian
Sure.
Studies,
Yeah.
and she said, "What else would we call it?" You know,
That's
um,
Marlene, right?
yeah,
Marlene for the
yeah.
world. Yes.
Um, Again, I encourage comments. I see Jack getting ready. Let's unmute you, Jack, in just a second. But can you put to rest, Angela? You mentioned the Orange Revolution. You were on duty at that time. We've heard many times from propagandists and also from naive Americans that the CIA created the Orange Revolution. Can we put that idea to rest?
I mean, we certainly can. First of all, the amusing part is that the Russians kept saying it was the Bush administration CIA and George Soros who did that, without understanding that George Soros, was a great critic of President Bush and the
Right.
Republicans. It's
Yeah.
a typical conspiracy theory. No, I mean, I've just said the intelligence community was taken by surprise at the Orange Revolution. They didn't believe the Ukrainians, were going to do this, would have the courage to go and camp out in the freezing rain and snow. So, of course, that's absolutely wrong. But, these theories flourish and they get worse in the age of social media.
Okay, can I now turn to the eminent, illustrious, and good-looking Jack Zetkulic? You are unmuted, Jack.
Thank you, Dan. Hi. Hello also from a former Georgetown RASP person. So hi.
Okay.
Um, You know, living now in a country where we've changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico officially, and I've also worked in the what used to be called the Persian Gulf for a while, and then the
Did you say
U.S.
Gulf of
military.
Mexico, Jack? I may have to turn you in.
Yes, yes, they'll drag me down. They'll drag me down the street by my heels.
Right. Yeah.
But even like the Saudis and the Emiratis wanted to call the Persian Gulf the Arabian Gulf, and our military even did that for a while, confusing many international pilots because
Oh, dear.
they would say, "Oh, am I over the Arabian Sea?" No, that's on the other side of Saudi Arabia. Uh, it's not. It is entertaining and it's fun and it's silly, but it's also really confusing uh, where people are. The British, for instance, in their when they break up the world, because of their imperial past and their naval past, they go by bodies of water. So
Hmm.
their Eastern Adriatic office would work. I worked with their Eastern Adriatic office
Hmm.
when I worked in Bosnia,
Yeah.
because that's the Eastern Adriatic. I mean, well, there's about this much of a border of a coastline of Bosnia with the Eastern Adriatic.
Yeah.
But I recall returning to the European Bureau at the State Department when Dick Holbrooke came in as the Assistant Secretary of State. And I
Hmm.
had previously worked in the Office for Central Europe.
Hmm.
And the Office of Central Europe ceased to exist. And the Office for Eastern Europe ceased to exist under his leadership, because he said there's no such thing as Eastern Europe. There's Central Europe and there's Russia.
Uh-huh.
Like, wait, scratch my head about that. I mean, where is Ukraine? Where is Belarus? What do we do with the Baltics? It's funny, it's entertaining, but it's also really important how we describe these people.
Hmm.
And yeah, I was in in the European Bureau when they said with this NIS thing. How long did that linger? About a decade, I guess. People were
Yeah.
still calling it the NIS.
Yeah.
Didn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the bureau, and then I recall Steve Solars, I guess, he insisted that our Middle East bureau, which used to cover all the way to Bangladesh, was suddenly split in half, and it became Central Asia and South Asia together in one bureau, EURSCA. But it, I just would counsel that, as silly as as these verbal machinations might be, um, they are important in the way people look at the world. And in the end, I actually did agree with Dick about Eastern Europe, kind of Central Europe suddenly being, extended farther and farther to the east, because it gave people a sense of home. And when we had Putin saying things like Ukraine never existed as an entity, even though it has existed for centuries over time, that it was only either the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. um, we do have to, take seriously our approach to where those lines are written on a map.
Hmm.
Thank you, Jack. And for everybody's benefit, Jack lightly touched on his work with Richard Holbrooke, who achieved something after the Balkans War. Jack served in Belgrade. And that's a whole other subject. And next fall, Jack, let's have a session just on that, because that's your involvement. And I believe it was your idea to have that conference in Dayton. Anyway,
Well,
thank you for that comment.
yeah, actually, it's the 30th anniversary this year,
Yeah.
and there's a big conference happening in Dayton. But I should note that Bosnia is also now probably in its worst political state than it has been in 30 years.
Well, also from your description, Jack, the food in Dayton is not, it's not worth a trip to Dayton, according to you.
I don't plan on going back for the event, no.
Let me look at here's Baxter Katz. If you can see the chat, Angela. I'm curious what's happened internally to the Russian leadership.
Leadership. Yeah.
Even in the early to mid 2010s, Russia, even as an authoritarian state, seemed to have at least sane leaders. Medvedev stands out as someone who seemed to be somewhat of a normal leader who has now totally lost his mind. wonder if you agree with that, at least judging by his tweets. Has the Russian leadership in the Putin era always held a strange pseudo-conspiratorial worldview, or is this something that developed only recently? I think it goes way back, I think.
That's a terrific question.
Yeah, thank you.
So, I would say those views, I mean, if you're talking about the older generation, right? Those views have always been there. I would also say that I recall a conversation with a man who was the US Consul General in St. Petersburg when Putin was the deputy mayor. And he says even then, he recalls a conversation with President Putin, for instance, saying that he didn't accept the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it was illegal, and that, this wasn't going to last forever. And for instance, he told both President Bush, as I've said, that Ukraine wasn't a country, but also President Clinton, when he was out of office. President Clinton said this at a conference at Georgetown a few years ago, that Putin had said that he didn't believe that Russia had to abide by any of the treaties that it had signed with Ukraine, and of course it hasn't abided by any of them. But Putin, if you look at Patrushev, who used to be the secretary, the head of the Security Council, he now has a different position, but he's still very influential. I mean, he writes also incredibly conspiratorial things. And then you had, in the when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, or maybe even UN ambassador before that, the Russians came out with the stuff that that the US needed to take over Siberia because we needed their natural resources, because we didn't have enough of our own. So you've had Putin talking about the US trying to break up Russia and cut it into small pieces over the decades. But I think this is much more strident now. And I think the Medvedev interlude is curious because we have to ask, was Medvedev at that point, was he real? Did he really want to have a better relationship with the West, with the United States? Or was that all a facade? And now the true Medvedev has come out. Now, I don't have the answer to that. But I think a lot of what you see in these very conspiratorially minded things, it's been lurking there forever, particularly among some people in the intelligence services. I mean, I would say that one thing that Yeltsin never did was to reform the intelligence services. I mean, he broke up the KGB into different parts, but they never really did a thorough, lustration of them, cleaning up them. And so you have a lot of people who, through the last few decades, continue to have these kind of conspiratorial views. And if you watch, as I sometimes have to do, although I only watch them in little bits, some of these nightly shows on Russian TV with the propagandist Vladimir Solovyov, whom you can see a video of 15 to 20 years ago, joking around with President Zelensky on a New Year's TV show in Moscow, or Olga Skabayeva, who's another one of the more egregious ones. You hear these conspiracy theories in spades. And last night on the Solovyov show, he claimed that the Russian attack on Sumy, which happened yesterday, which killed so many people, this was a put-up job. It was a made-up job, and that was the French and the Germans and maybe the British and the US that staged it. Just as they said after the massacre at Bucha, this had actors on it. So these things have never gone away, but they're now much more permissible and legitimized than they would have been 10 years ago.
Yeah, post-truth. Not to pick at a scab, but the Perezagruska story. I met a Russian teacher once who said that the teachers at Foreign Service Institute had spent months with Secretary Clinton trying to get her to say Perezagruska. And it came out wrong, as you said, Perezagruska. It's just a funny afterthought. She's a brilliant person, but apparently the words don't stay with her very long.
Well, I guess if you don't know Russian, it's hard to.
No, but they spend hours and hours. It's not that complicated.
Okay.
Let's go to Naomi Korn's question, which may be among our last. To what extent would you say Russia's aggression to defend or force this so-called equality of unequals, how much is it rooted in an inability to define a national identity outside of its presumed great power status? And why is that? Does that make sense,
Oh,
Angela?
that's a terrific question, and you're
We
quite
have only terrific people here.
right. No. So Russians appear to believe that that Russia is the only empire, right, which where the sun will never set and will never collapse. The Romans, the Greeks, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Austro-Hungarians, the Ottomans, all empires eventually come to an end. And we believed that in 1991, the Soviet Empire, which was really an extension of the Russian Empire, had come to an end. But they don't accept this. They don't have a national identity. It's during the Yeltsin period, there was a competition for who could come up with a new definition of Russian identity, and it failed. I mean, people wrote papers, but no one accepted it. So the Russian identity today is the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and that is Russia and all Russian speakers all around the world, and they're part of this unique civilization, which Putin and others around him talk about. It's a superior civilization. At this point, they talk about the West, it's decadent, Western Christianity is satanic, and that Russia is the harbinger of this superior civilization, and which also now includes traditional family values. So part of the relatively newer public national identity that Putin puts forward is Russia as the defender of these values against the woke West. And by the way, we don't have time to talk about that, but that's why so many MAGA supporters are pro-Russian, because of this kind of anti-woke traditional family values. So it's the Russian national identity today is a kind of a mishmash of other things. But one of the essential elements is, and this is how Putin sees himself and talks about it, that it is his almost sacred duty. He's become also almost messianic to restore the territories that rightly belong to Russia and that were taken away from it when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is a very deep-seated, I think, belief among many Russians. Among younger Russians, not so much, but more than you might want to believe.
The sources of this would be Alexander Dugin, and who else?
I mean, Dugin, he's one of the main ones, but there are other people that, that share this kind of ideology, but he's the main propagandist of it. And, he was on Fareed Zakaria's CNN show, I guess 10 days ago, talking about this. And they now see with Donald Trump's election a vindication of these beliefs.
Mm-hmm. So maybe to conclude, you've probably met Steve Witkoff. If you were to talk to him this week, what would your advice be to Steve Witkoff?
Well, I've certainly never met him. I mean, my advice to him would be to get as much information as he can and surround himself with experts on this area to understand what the real situation is, and to be able to, if you like, disentangle, deconstruct some of the things that Putin has said to him, and to understand that, this war was not provoked by Ukraine, and that Crimea was not always Russian.
Well, I have many more questions. You probably have a schedule, and I want to be respectful of that. We've really benefited from your wisdom, Angela, and we need you. We need you. I hope that this administration will take your ideas into account. They would be foolish not to. I just note we've all noticed about Tim Snyder and Marcy Shore leaving the country. Marcy Shore is a great friend of this program. It's very saddening, but also I do understand why they've done that. I feel it's a great loss for us, and I don't demean them or criticize them at all for the decision they've made. They've been great. They've been a great help in understanding this whole terrible situation. Angela Stent, thank you very much. It's been really great, and I hope we can do this again next fall when we have a full contingent. And счастливого пути. Всего хорошего.
Спасибо, спасибо. Дякую. Bye-bye.
Дякую. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody else, if you would stay on for a minute, we'll talk a little bit about, there we go.